I'm Shelley Carrot, and I am thrilled to be sitting up here with the three individuals. We're going to use this time now to give you a chance to ask them questions and also to give them a chance to talk to you about their journey and the process. You've seen the end product. You didn't see them back in January when they answered my call to adventure. When I called them on the phone and they said, maybe. And in January, when I brought them together on a conference call and described to them, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have 8 weeks. I'm going to put this little timeline together. I'm going to give this to you, and here's what we're going to do. And there was a silence on the other end. But what was good is I didn't get an email message from any of them saying, I've reconsidered. They stuck it out. So what we're going to do now is kind of take you through that process. So this is our backdrop. This is a 7-step process or formula that was presented to them. And you can see the 7 steps here. Not that you necessarily had to follow it in order, and every one of them was going to have a different journey. But you can see here you've got the audience, you've got the message, story, media, slides, delivery, and impact. So we began this journey. And I think the first question I had, especially as we've gone through 8 weeks together, and remember, they're living in different places. We have Sophia in Boston, we have Judy in Seattle, Washington, and we have Miguel, who is there in Greenbelt, Maryland. So we're doing this from a distance, trying to stay kind of on the same page and trying to follow this process. And they have other things they're doing with their life, with their job. This is the extra. So now that we've gotten to the end here, I really have to ask my first question. Why? Why did you accept my call? Why did you take this journey? Anyone? Why?
Okay, so I as you know, Shelley, I had just come out of a press release at the American Geophysical Union, and we had given out some of the preliminary results. The paper's still under peer review. It's a very early period. And I remember thinking, and after we talked, I got introduced to several people. So, oh, you're that guy who did that Christmas, you're the Christmas tree guy. And I thought, but it's more than that. And this was an opportunity for me, in great part, to really give you the story of what it means that we have this new capability that can impact so many people's lives, and that provides you with a new perspective of how we can study the Earth. And I hadn't had that message tuned up in the press release, so the whole thing was, yeah, Christmas lights, you go, man. It's like, no, it's, and it was frustrating at the time. And so we went through the holidays, immediately after the holidays, through that process. And it says, I want to go through this process. I know the value of this. I just need to know how to present it in a manner that is useful to the audience. And so that's how it started.
All right. Judy?
I think for me, part of it was professional. Our office is really concerned with getting what we learned from our research and studies out into practice. That's our mission. And I think we were Kevin and I think Kevin would agree with this, is that we were producing too many reports that weren't read. So how do we actually break down what we're finding out into manageable bits? And storytelling seemed to be a really good way to do that. I have a background in journalism, which I kind of forgot about when I went and got my PhD, because there are very different ways of dealing with data and stuff. But it struck me that that's exactly what we were doing. We were doing public interest kinds of things, where you actually had to look at the audience and understand what it was that they needed, and at what level, and what data, and how do you tell it. This is, I think, going to have a huge impact on how we communicate what we are learning through our projects, is that we have to use this method. We can talk data to scientists, but if we are communicating to a larger audience, they want to know what the value is, what it will do for them, how it will make their life different. And you can only tell that with a story.
I think for I think for me it was both professional and personal. I'm coming from a small agency, but a small agency with a really big mission. And so I wanted to share with our federal colleagues what we did and how we did it and how we're trying to change. But then personally, I don't do this kind of thing. I'm happiest when I do have millions of lines of data and I get to look at it all day. And so this was me coming out of my comfort zone and trying to learn something new and see if it was something I could do. And I'm not sure if I'm going to do it ever again. But I wanted to try it, and I wanted to see that if it is something I could learn, then perhaps it would be one more way to persuade the people that I do need to persuade on a daily basis, on a less frequent basis. But do I have other mechanisms by which to get my message across?
Thank you. All right, and now let's all take a look at the 7 circles. Over the 8-week period of time, we've gone through all the circles, maybe some of them more times than others, and maybe back and forth among the circles. But one thing I'd ask the group to think about is pick a circle. If you are to communicate to this audience about a circle that resonated the most with you, which circle would that be and why? So pick your circle.
So for me, it was the message circle. What is your message? That's something you have to define before you start. And then along the way, don't say anything that doesn't relate to the message. It's not a long time. It's not a long story. And if there's extra in there that doesn't relate to your main message, people won't remember it, or it will distract from the message that you're trying to convey. So that's what was most helpful for me. And then every word I thought of, if it didn't relate to the message, then it came out. So that was a very helpful lesson.
I think for me it was the audience, really focusing on where they come from, what their background is, and the messages need to be skewed a little bit differently, I think, for each of the audience. So, and that's a big factor with our office, is trying to understand the audience. We have multiple audience. Some is the general public, and some are, a big portion is the federal government, and how we may be communicating to them differently. Their interests may be different. Their needs may be different. And there may be very specialized groups within those. You speak to technology people different than others. So I think the audience was a key one for me. I think the message came a little bit easier. And that may be because of my journalism background, but the audience, I think we really need to tailor things for our audiences really effectively.
Well, for me, it was also the message, and in particular because I have so much content to deal with, and I wanted to share with the audience so many things. Even until like 17 hours ago, thanks, Sophia, we had to cut a significant amount of things that related to the intricacies of data and how you process this data. I wanted to provide this message that you just don't open the doors of an instrument and get Christmas lights. No, there's a huge amount of people that are involved in doing this. But the main message related to humanity gets kind of like lost as a result. And we were just practicing yesterday, and Sophia pointed out, Miguel, you were talking about Puerto Rico, and then you go into this whole algorithm thing, and then you go into the passionate argument and doing why do you need this in the middle? Just cut it out. And I was like, and I had Shelley said the same thing, and I was like, no, because that's what NASA's all about, data. And you feel that you want to portray, the best of the agency, but at the same time you're carrying the story, and you're still doing that, And so trimming all those excesses so that you can keep yourself on message is going to be key, especially for those who begin at version 1 with 150 slides. That's going to be key.
All right, so I'll tell you a little story in the exercise. And you're hearing here, I hope, how they've come together. Again, they're spread out across the country, but through this experience, they really beat on one another. They're constructive with one another, and in the end, we even hug and we might exchange Christmas cards, Christmas lights. There we go. One thing that they were saying here, but I just want to bring it out a little more for you all, is they did something called message mapping when they started this. I'd first asked too early. I asked them, what was your big idea? And for that big idea, I said that big idea is a statement. Okay? What's at stake, and what are you trying, what's the intent? So give me the big idea. And when they just kind of looked at me and then they started filling around, I said, okay, but that's still too much. That idea is a paragraph long. So now I want you to give it to me in a Twitter-friendly headline. And then they really looked at me. They still weren't there yet. You haven't noticed this, but when you look at their slides, the introductory slides, there is a Twitter message there. They got to that point after we've worked through this and we've refined and refined. But what I realized is, maybe it's the teacher in me, having to take that step back and not trying to push this too fast, and let's do some message mapping. So we started out with, let's do a big idea, a single big idea you want to get across because you have 18 minutes. And then from there, I said, what are the 3 key messages? Now, if you were to dissect the presentation, and you've just listened to it, so maybe when we put it up and we post it on YouTube, you can go back with new ideas here or new information, because they were then asked to construct, from the big idea, give me just 3 key messages. And under each message now, give me some bullet points. What's the stats? What's the example? What's the story? And then they began to build the presentation. So they spent an incredible amount of time, I'd say, on those first 3 circles, right? The audience, message, story. Because only at that point, when they had that down, did they even start thinking about how they were going to display it and communicate it. So now let me go to my next question here. So this process that they went through, they were always being emphasized that they had to shift their goal from transferring information to producing an experience. This is where that storytelling comes in. So the storytelling structure says you have a beginning, you have a middle, you have an end. There's a context, there's conflict, there's complication, there's a call to action, maybe a resolution, and then bliss. Again, you've just seen them do this, but you need to understand what they went through. So let me ask you guys this. What advice would you now give to your audience here on how you made that shift from going from giving information to producing an experience for the audience?
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I was lucky enough to have Shelly be a local and had her come into Greenbelt, and she's a teacher, so we brought in a big board, and we literally mapped the entire talk. And so we have the pulses for this talk. We have the beginning. And this beginning, you're going to introduce the audience to Miguel and what you do, so that you get a sense of feelings like, oh, he's talking about, stuff that new stuff about Puerto Rico. That's nice. And then you go into the body, and you have 10 minutes to do this. And as you structure this, you're saying, wow, I have way too much in this beginning. I'm barely getting into the meat of the story. And so you even though you're passionate and you want to keep these slides because you've worked so hard on them, it takes you 40 terabytes worth of data to put this slide, and just let it go.
It was hard, Miguel.
It was hard. But, and as you structure this, we took pictures of the board. I put that in my office, and we start getting scrubby, so I have to print it again and again. And we had these messages, and I showed it to everybody. It's like, this is what it happens. You have to have it mapped out and then systemically go through it and just abide by it. And when you do that, then you can objectively decide how to cut. That was the biggest thing for me, how to cut.
I think I kind of started a little bit differently. I think sort of the key points, but I quickly went into a script, which for me would have been a journalism story. And you get stuck right away. You have to have a lead. And I worked with a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, and boy, he was after, what is that lead? What is that lead? Why is that the lead? Isn't there something else? So it was getting that story started was a really big component. And I got some really nice help with them. They suggested they walk through the day, and I chose Kevin to walk through the day with. So there was some really good help there, but I really structured my story pretty early because that's the way I think. So it was easy, but the component parts, what you left in, and what you took out, I think were really important. And having that 18-minute deadline, just, you really did have to cut and use only the stuff that really was imageable, memorable, things of that sort. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that.
Well, for me, it was Shelley and my buddy Dwayne's idea to pick a case, because that's my experience every day. And so that made sense to tell the story of the commission. And then from there, it was trying to figure out what part of that experience is interesting and impactful. And it was funny because in the beginning, I was like, well, I want to know exactly how you investigate a Ponzi scheme. And I was like, no, you actually don't. It's really tedious and it's not fun, and I don't think the audience wants to hear about that for 18 minutes. So it was taking my everyday and my months and my weeks and how they turned out, and finding the pieces that would be interesting and entertaining, but also have an impact.
Miguel, can you tell the group what is meant by the billboard?
Yes.
That would be under the slides, because that was something for you, right? The billboard.
Right, so we have, that's the component where you partition all these components all the way into your call to action and how much you're going to apportion all this. You begin with your introduction and just a quick understanding that attracts you. And for me, it's like, well, you don't know who I am, so I have to introduce you to my work and how do you became passionate for the work that you started. It's so very similar to how we began. And then what I try to do is to see whether I can fit within the meat of the discussion. You have to have a way to convey what you know and what can be possible about your story. And so that's talking about a new mission, a new data set. It's so early, so you can state the fact, we use Landsat for all these years, but here's what we can do in the future if we combine all these technologies together. So you go into these ups and downs, the basics, the stats, and the things that we could do if we put our minds to it. And then you come out with something, a punch, an EKG of a city dying, and something that you will always remember. That's your star moment. And from there, you bring a call to action, and we iterated a lot about it, because at first I thought, well, let's just not focus on our homes and greening our homes, let's focus on greening our community. And that in and of itself should be good enough. But I thought as we look into the data and look at this star plot, that was just going to be just one part of the big problem. And so looking at issues of energy access, of energy security, and the intersection with climate change, I think that's really the big problem. And so that was the big challenge, to be able to do that. And it was just like a week ago that really found the big idea. So it's through this process you will see that you will learn a lot about what you do. So it's not just a benefit in terms of presenting it to an audience, but in helping further the science and understanding its discoveries.
So he mentioned star moment, and you're thinking, oh yeah, stars. No, he's not talking NASA.
Yes, it's not.
STAR was an acronym for something the audience will always remember, star moment, right? So he mentioned here the heartbeat, some of the words that might be used, or like Sophia, when she had the boxes in her office, and she talked about 35,000. We talked about, do we do the huge red number, 35,000 over that slide? Because you want to give a startling or a shocking statistic, something that's going to hit the audience and make them go, whoa, right? So we looked in this process, did they have something here that we should call out as a star moment? So I just wanted to be clear on that. The other thing I want to let you guys talk about also, we talked about the billboards, was the 3-second rule. Think of yourselves as you drive down the highway and you see a billboard. You're driving, right? So you can't look at it that long, right? You've got to be able to process that information quickly. And billboards are done in a way that you should be able to absorb that information in 3 seconds or less, all right? 3 seconds or less. So what we worked on here was So they looked at their media, they looked at their slides, and they put it out there, and I was like, whoa, Because when you're thinking about the billboards, and you're thinking about the flow of information, you know what? You can't drive and watch the billboard at the same time. At the same time, the audience cannot listen to you, watch you, hear you, and watch another flow of information, which is your presentation. So we talked about that 3-second rule, didn't we? And Miguel, you were the worst person at this, right?
Yeah,
So,
we cut a lot of text. You know, I just need to show you the imagery, and I can explain it myself. I don't need to add details, and you know, I can just speak to you instead of speaking to the slides. That's really the point. In science, you want to have enough data out there for those that was just going to print it out or take a picture. But in this case, you're absolutely right. That's what you want to do. You want to trim and just have those senses focus on you.
emotional texture.
Yeah. And I think one of the realizations that hit me really strong was that when you do a presentation, typically you rely on the slide to tell you what to say. This is exactly the opposite. Your slides reinforce what you've already determined is your story. And there's a lot more that you have to remember yourself, and you can't rely on your slides to tell it, themselves. You can't just look and say, read the data, which is what we all do. We start with words on a slide. It's like words on paper. And I've done lots of those, and lots of graphs that people can't read. And I think that this really made me think about, that gets back to the audience. What are they going to take away? They're not going to remember the words. They would be much better with a image from something. But it's a really different process, but much more powerful in terms of, and the image of the boxes was a perfect one, and looking at, I would have just croaked if I had to go through all that paperwork to find something, that make the story out of that paper, which is your story about the Ponzi schemes. So I think that it's far more than words. It really is the imagery and the words you're saying, not the words on the paper.
We're going to take questions. So if anyone from the audience has questions, I can see the waving back there. We've got some questions that have come in from Adobe Connect. So why don't we go ahead and start with that, and then if you do have a question in the audience here, please come to the podium and we'll take your question.
All right. Well, first off, there's been a lot of compliments that have been provided to the whole panel here, and then the question, I think, Shelley, was more directed towards you, but I think every one of you could probably talk a little bit more in depth. And this came in a couple of minutes ago, so if you feel like you've already covered it, I'm okay with that. But the question was really directed toward how do you get comfortable with a narrative that you have to, and the visuals that you look to develop versus, and that new approach for some people to presenting data to an audience. It's a comfort level versus, the going through the process.
I like that question because I changed my slides up until the very last minute, and it was helpful to be given the advice that come up with your story first and then think about your slides. And so that was good because I usually go the other way, but then after that, I liked a lot of the slides that I had. I and actually others worked hard to make them for me, but. It was getting comfortable with the story first and then telling the story to yourself and realizing that you don't need certain slides and eliminating them. And that was hard, but which comes first? The story came first, and if something didn't support the story or enhance the story, then it had to come out. And so just keeping that in mind every step of the way is what helped me determine where to be at the end.
I completely agree with that. I think you use your illustrations to support the story, and that's not what we normally do. And I think that was the real eye-opener for me with this experience. And it did get out of my comfort zone because I rely on those words on the slides to remember what I'm going to say. And you can't do that in this process. You really have to know the story well enough to tell it, and the slides reinforce it.
Well, this brings me into the audience circle because I thought that I knew that the driver that I need to have in order to be disciplined about what I wanted to put in and take out had to do a lot with the audience members. And I know that there's a lot of people here from federal agencies that may be interested in what I show. And I didn't want suddenly to talk about cloud masking, aerosol correction, and NDVI retrieval, all these things that are technical to suddenly go in the way of being able to provide a story that can say, hey, I can connect to this. I know what he means by dealing with development in Africa or something like that. And if I were to put that I was trying to put myself in that person's shoes and say, well, that whole part was interesting, but then you confused me with all the other stuff, and then I lost interest. Sorry. And so it's partly through being thoughtful about what the audience would perceive the presentation.
I'm Michael Metzker from NASA, and first I'd like to thank all three of you for going through this process. I understand the journey wasn't easy, but sometimes those lessons that aren't easy, we remember a lot more. I'm from an organization, NASA, and we're loaded with data. We're also loaded with passion. I've got lots of engineers and scientists who cannot tell stories because they're so inundated by the data. So I understand your call to action is to tell more of a story rather than the presentation. I get that. What's the next step for the rest of us? How do we get to where you are?
Shelley's coming to all of our agencies and giving us personal training.
Clone Shelley. I think one of the things with the great materials that Shelley put together for us, and also having somebody else go through the process with you. So if you do this, find a buddy. And have a presentation in mind, a conference that puts a little pressure on you. If we had just had this in like a seminar, I don't think we would have done nearly as well as having the pressure of creating something that we have to then deliver. So I would find a buddy, read some of those materials. They were really great. Look at TED Talks, see how people structure them. We're storytellers by nature, because before we had the printed word, all we did was sit around the fire, tell stories. So we all know how to tell stories. We don't know how to tell stories about our data. That's the problem.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Everyone does have your guide, right? Or
This is a pilot that we're doing, so we'll see what comes out of the surveys where we go next.
So Shelley put together for us a guide that was extremely helpful. It was short and it was targeted, but walking through it is what led us to where we are right now. And then watching TED Talks. I watched many and learned quite a bit, but just seeing how other people do it. But I think the most important for me was telling my story along the way to people who don't know anything about what I do, but also people who do it with me every day. And so the feedback that I got was different. And I think that I got a lot from this group here, but I got even more from the people who do this work with me. And when they heard their work in the form of a story rather than, here's my data, that's when they realized that their message before hadn't been getting across very well. And so they were able to highlight for me the places where I should emphasize, because even in the story, the message wasn't getting across, and it definitely wasn't getting across in the underlying data.
Thank you, and that really hits on Circle 6 and Circle 7. More to come. Steve.
Sure. Hi, I'm Steve Rocklin with GSA. I've actually had the privilege of working alongside Shelley and the whole team that's been putting this event together. So kudos to that team. It's really been a privilege to watch it. This is marvelous stuff. Thank you. So one thing that's come across loud and clear, at least to me, is that in order to do this well, you've got to work hard at it. It takes a long time, takes real sweat. And so I'm thinking this is terrific, but if I want to be able to do this on a semi-regular basis, am I going to have the time to really develop my presentations into something as compelling as this? So my question is, and this is maybe as much for you, Shelley, as for the panelists, is, I don't want to use the word shortcuts, but are there certain steps in this process or messages that give you the most bang for the buck? That if I wanted to get, the 80-20 of the benefits for a presentation, I should focus on those things?
Can answer that. Oh, there definitely are. I mean, for one, we just have to remove all text on PowerPoints. That's just a given. You can do so much in terms of very basic things from day to day, the same thing as we can do with lighting. And that can make a huge impact. And if you lead by example, if you cut, if I remember one of my faculty advisors says that the amount of length of text, you can have more than 5 words times 3 lines. Actually, you shouldn't need any text at all. If you are at that level where you're giving up a story and you're putting, so these are very basic things that you can do without even having a manual and the manual just helps you structure it in a way, and you're going to need to have some time to go through it. There's no shortcuts for that, but there are some very, very basic things that we can start as agencies to make things better.
I agree, and I think that one of the things is to figure out what your messages are. What is it you want to say, and why is that important? And I think we do these top of the head sometimes rather than really thinking through what is this, and I had a lot of help with my presentation, but what is the essence of what it is that we want to get across? And why is that valuable to the people we want to tell it to? And what do we want them to do with it? I think we just start, from research, we just start writing reports. This is what we did, this is what we learned, this is our methods. We never say, what is the value of this to you, and why should we do it, and why should you work to change? So I think the message, getting those 3 to 4 to 5 messages down, takes a while, but then you structure your story around those. That's, I think the critical part is just getting those key messages really early. And it takes some thought, but once you get the first one, the second one is easier. And then when you do this the second time, it's easier. So it's that first time is a burden, but the messages are absolutely critical.
I think that last point is most important, that we went through a lot here to learn this new technique, but now we've learned it. And so I think it will come more naturally
Like riding a bike.
after this. It is. It's like riding a bike. It's like learning a program. But then you've learned it. And so I don't think it's any additional time the next time from a normal presentation. And I think all of us in our work every day are cutting things down. For us on cases, we have 10 million pieces of paper. We can't submit them all to court. We have to do 20 pages of evidence. And so we're taking a lot of things and bringing them down to a single message all the time. It's just this process, this initiative is teaching us to convey that message in a different fashion.
It's like riding a bike. The first time, you're going to fall off, you're going to be a little wobbly, and you get better at it. So thank you all for this. I'm going to wrap this up now. Steve, thank you. And if you will return to your seats, we're going to take it to the close. So thank you, panelists.